He was homeless, broken, down to his very last piece of bread. But when he found a dying dog in a dark alley, he didn't think twice. He shared the only thing he had left, even though it meant going hungry that night. The next morning, 3 black SUVs pulled up to his cardboard shelter. Men in expensive suits stepped out, and they said 5 words that shattered his reality. "Mr. Carlson, you're a billionaire now." But here's what they didn't tell him. The people who tried to kill that dog's owner, they were still out there, watching, waiting, and now they were coming for him. How did one act of kindness turn a homeless veteran into a hunted man? What deadly secret did that stray dog carry? Stay with me, because what you're about to hear is the true story of how sharing a crust of bread in a New York City alley triggered a conspiracy that would expose billionaires, murderers, and a web of lies that reached all the way to the Pentagon. This is the story of Pedro Carlson, a man the world had forgotten, until the world needed him most. Just before we dive deeper into this story, if you're enjoying it so far, please take 2 seconds to hit the like button. It genuinely helps these stories reach more people. And if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe now so you don't miss the ending of this story or the next one. I'd also love to know where our community is listening from, so quickly drop a comment with what country you're watching from. Let's get back to the story. New York City, October 17th, 11:47 p.m. Most people were asleep in their warm beds. But for Pedro Carlson, sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not anymore. He sat huddled beneath a piece of torn cardboard in an alley behind a Chinese restaurant in Hell's Kitchen. The rain had finally stopped, but the cold never did. It seeped through his worn military jacket, the only thing he had left from his old life. Pedro was 32 years old, but if you looked at his face, you'd think he was 50. That's what the streets do to you. They age you. They hollow you out. They make you invisible. 6 years ago, Pedro Carlson wasn't homeless. He was Sergeant Pedro Carlson, United States Army, K-9 unit. Decorated. Respected. He had a purpose. His partner was a German shepherd named Titan. Together, they'd saved 23 lives in Afghanistan. 23 soldiers who got to go home to their families because Pedro and Titan found the IEDs before they detonated. But then everything changed. It was 2019. Pedro's unit was ordered to conduct illegal surveillance on American civilians. The orders came from high up, so high that questioning them was considered treason. But Pedro couldn't do it. He wouldn't. That's what got him court-martialed. They called it insubordination. They stripped him of his rank, his honor, and his future. Dishonorable discharge. Blacklisted from every security job in the country. And Titan, his best friend, the dog who'd save his life more times than he could count, the military kept him, reassigned him. Pedro never saw him again. 3 months later, Titan died on a mission in Syria. Pedro wasn't even notified. That was 3 years ago. Since then, Pedro had been on the streets. He'd applied to over 200 jobs. But that dishonorable discharge followed him everywhere like a shadow. Eventually, he stopped trying. The shelters became his home. The alleys became his refuge. And shame became his constant companion. But tonight, Pedro had something. One small victory in an ocean of losses. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a carefully wrapped piece of bread. It was from the shelter on 9th Avenue. They'd given it to him that morning, and he'd saved it all day. His only meal. His hands were shaking as he unwrapped it. Not from excitement. From hunger. He was about to take his first bite when he heard it. A weak, desperate whimpering. Coming from behind the dumpster, about 15 feet away. Every instinct told him to ignore it. He was starving. He needed this food. Whatever was back there wasn't his problem. But Pedro couldn't help himself. He walked toward the sound. When he reached the dumpster and looked behind it, his heart stopped. It was a dog. A German shepherd. Lying on its side in a pool of rainwater, barely breathing. Its ribs were showing through its matted fur. Its eyes were half closed, and around its neck was an expensive leather collar. For a moment, Pedro couldn't move, because this dog looked exactly like Titan. Pedro dropped to his knees beside the dog, not caring about the cold water soaking through his jeans. "Hey, boy," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Hey, it's okay. I'm here." The dog's eyes flickered open slightly, just enough to look at Pedro. And in that look, Pedro saw something he recognized.
Pain. Fear.
And the desperate hope that anyone would help. Pedro looked down at the bread in his hand. His last meal. The only thing standing between him and another hungry night. Then he looked back at the dog. The dog was dying. That much was clear. Without food, without help, it wouldn't survive till morning. Pedro made his decision. He broke the piece of bread in half. Without hesitation. Without regret. He placed the larger piece in front of the dog's mouth. "Here you go, boy," Pedro whispered, his eyes filling with tears.
"Eat.
Please eat." The dog's nose twitched. Slowly, painfully slowly, it lifted its head and took the bread. It chewed weakly, barely able to swallow. Pedro stroked the dog's head gently. "That's it.
Good boy.
You're going to be okay." The dog finished the bread and looked up at Pedro with those dark, intelligent eyes. And for the first time in 3 years, Pedro felt something other than shame. He felt purpose. The temperature was dropping. The dog was shivering violently now. Pedro knew that look.
Hypothermia.
He'd seen it in the field. Without thinking, Pedro scooped the dog up and carried it back to his cardboard shelter. He laid the dog down gently and then did something that surprised even himself. He took off his military jacket, the last piece of his old life, and wrapped it around the dog. Then Pedro lay down beside it, curling his body around the shivering animal, sharing what little warmth he had left. "We're going to get through this," Pedro whispered into the dog's ear. "Both of us. I promise." The dog let out a soft whimper and pressed closer to Pedro. And for the first time in 3 years, Pedro Carlson didn't feel alone. They fell asleep like that. A broken man and a dying dog, both forgotten by the world. Neither of them knew that by morning, everything would change. October 18th, 7:23 a.m. Pedro woke to a sound he'd never heard before in that alley. Expensive car engines. His eyes snapped open, and his military training kicked in immediately. 3 black SUVs had pulled into the alley, blocking both exits. The car doors opened. 5 men stepped out, all wearing dark suits and sunglasses. One of them, tall, black, probably in his 50s with silver hair, walked forward slowly, holding up a tablet. "Mr. Pedro Carlson," the man called out. Pedro froze. No one had called him Mr. in 3 years. "Who's asking?" Pedro said, his voice rough from sleep. The man came closer and lowered his sunglasses. His eyes were kind. "My name is Daniel Wright. I'm an attorney with Morrison, Wright and Associates. These are my associates and security personnel." The dog stirred at Pedro's side and lifted its head, suddenly alert. Its ears went up, and it stared at the men intensely. Daniel's face broke into a smile of pure relief. "Blaze," he whispered. "Thank God. We found him." Pedro looked down at the dog, Blaze, then back at the lawyer.
"Wait.
This is your dog." "Not my dog," Daniel said carefully. "But yes, we've been looking for him. For 3 months." Daniel held up the tablet and turned it toward Pedro. On the screen was a video. A man, late 60s, white hair, wearing an expensive suit, sitting in what looked like a library. His face was gaunt, tired, but his eyes were sharp. The man spoke directly into the camera. "My name is Gerald Eubanks. If you're watching this, it means I'm either missing or dead. And it means someone has done a great kindness to my dog, Blaze. I don't have much time, so I'll make this clear. I'm leaving everything I own to whoever saves Blaze. Not my nephew. Not my business partners. Whoever shows compassion to my dog when they have nothing to gain, they are the only person I can trust with my fortune. The man paused, coughing. To the person watching this, you don't know me, but I know you. Because only someone with a pure heart would help a dying animal when they themselves are suffering. That's character. That's what I've spent 40 years searching for in people. And I never found it until now. Pedro stared at the blank screen, his mind unable to process what he'd just heard. That's Gerald Eubanks, the tech billionaire. Pedro looked up at Daniel, his face pale. The news said he's dead. Not dead, Daniel said quietly. Missing. 3 months ago, Gerald Eubanks disappeared from his penthouse in Manhattan.
No trace.
No body. No ransom demand. Just gone. But his will was very specific. He left a holographic video will on his encrypted phone. That video you just saw. It was programmed to be sent to my firm if he didn't check in for 72 consecutive hours. Pedro shook his head, backing away. This is insane. This is some kind of prank. Mr. Carlson, Daniel said firmly, I assure you this is not a prank. Gerald Eubanks's estate is valued at $4.7 billion. And according to his will, it all belongs to whoever saved his dog. The alley spun around Pedro. His legs felt weak. That's impossible. I didn't save anybody. I just gave him some bread. Daniel's smile was sad. Mr. Carlson, you shared your last meal with a dying animal. You gave up your jacket. You could have walked away, sold that expensive collar, called animal control. But you didn't. You stayed with him all night. That's exactly what Gerald was looking for. Daniel stepped closer. You're a man of character. And that's what Gerald valued above everything else. Pedro felt tears burning in his eyes. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like him. Mr. Carlson, Daniel said, I need you to come with us. We need to take you to Gerald's estate. There are legal procedures, paperwork, and there are people who are going to challenge this will. People who want what you're about to inherit. Daniel's face grew serious. As of this moment, you are the sole beneficiary of the Eubanks estate. That includes his company, Eubanks Technologies, his properties, his investments, and his liquid assets. You're a billionaire, Pedro. And you need to understand something. Not everyone is going to be happy about that. Pedro looked around the alley, at his cardboard box, at the dumpster where he'd found Blaze, at the life he'd been living for 3 years. And then he looked at Blaze, who hadn't left his side. Okay, Pedro whispered. I'll come. But as he climbed into the SUV, Pedro couldn't shake the feeling in his gut. The feeling that this wasn't a blessing. It was the beginning of something dangerous. And he was right. The drive from Hell's Kitchen to the Upper East Side took 25 minutes. But for Pedro, it felt like traveling to another planet. The SUV pulled up to a mansion that looked like it belonged in a movie. 6 stories. Stone facade. Windows that gleamed like diamonds. A circular driveway with a fountain in the center. When he got out of the car, Blaze jumped out beside him and immediately pressed against his leg. The dog hadn't left his side since the alley. Stay close to him, Daniel said, noticing. Blaze knows who to trust. And right now you're going to need that. Inside, the entrance hall was breathtaking. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, oil paintings that probably cost more than most people's houses. But Pedro barely noticed any of it, because standing in the center of the hall were 2 people, and the looks on their faces were pure venom. The first was a man in his early 40s. Expensive suit, slicked back blonde hair, cold blue eyes that assessed Pedro like he was an insect. The second was a woman in her 50s. Elegant, Asian features, a frozen smile that didn't reach her eyes. Daniel cleared his throat. Mr. Carlson, allow me to introduce Derek Eubanks, Gerald's nephew and Chief Operating Officer of Eubanks Technologies. Derek didn't extend his hand. He just stared at Pedro with barely concealed disgust. "This is the homeless man?" Derek said, his voice dripping with contempt. "This is who my uncle supposedly left everything to?" "According to the will, yes," Daniel said evenly.
Derek laughed.
It was a cruel sound. "This is absurd. My uncle was clearly suffering from dementia or was under undue influence. No sane person would leave a multi-billion-dollar empire to a vagrant." Daniel continued, "And this is Victoria Chin, Chief Financial Officer of Eubanks Technologies and Gerald's business partner for the past 15 years. Victoria's smile widened, but her eyes remained cold. "Mr. Carlson, I'm sure this must all be very overwhelming for you. A man of your limited background suddenly thrust into a world of corporate complexity and vast wealth. We want you to know that Derek and I are here to help you navigate this difficult transition." Derek stepped forward, his hands in his pockets. "Let me be direct, Mr. Carlson. My uncle was mentally unstable in his final months. This will is a product of that instability. We will be challenging it in court, and we will win." "On what grounds?" Daniel asked, his voice sharp. "On the grounds that this man is a disgraced military veteran with a dishonorable discharge. A man with no fixed address, no employment history for 3 years, and no qualifications whatsoever to manage a company worth billions." Pedro felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. His dishonorable discharge. Of course, they'd already dug that up. Derek moved closer to Pedro, invading his personal space. "You're not equipped for this, Mr. Carlson. You're going to be eaten alive by the board, the shareholders, the media. They're going to tear you apart." Then Derek's voice dropped to a whisper. "And that's if you survive long enough to face them." Suddenly, Blaze's entire body went rigid. The dog stepped between Pedro and Derek, his lips pulling back to reveal his teeth. A deep, threatening growl rumbled from his chest. Derek stepped back quickly, his face pale. "Control that animal." But Blaze didn't move. His eyes were locked on Derek, every muscle tense like he was ready to attack. "Blaze, easy," Pedro said softly, placing a hand on the dog's head.
"Easy, boy."
Blaze stopped growling, but didn't look away from Derek. Victoria watched the exchange with calculating eyes. How strange. Blaze was always such a gentle dog. I've never seen him act aggressively toward anyone. "Maybe he knows something we don't," Daniel said pointedly. Derek straightened his tie, trying to regain his composure. "Mr. Wright, we'll be filing our legal challenge by the end of the week. I suggest you prepare your client for a very long and very public battle." "And, Mr. Carlson," Victoria added, her voice like honey over poison, "if you'd like to avoid all of this unpleasantness, we're prepared to make you a very generous offer. $50 million.
Cash.
To walk away quietly. $50 million. Pedro had been living on the street for 3 years. It would be so easy.
Take the money.
Disappear. Go live somewhere quiet. Finally have peace. But then he looked down at Blaze. The dog was still watching Derek and Victoria with intense distrust. And Pedro realized something. Gerald Eubanks had trusted this dog's judgment. That's why Blaze was the test. And Blaze hated these two people. Pedro looked up at Victoria and Derek. "No," he said quietly. Victoria's smile finally cracked. "Excuse me? I said no. I'm not taking your money." Derek's face turned red. "You're making a mistake. A huge mistake." "Maybe," Pedro said, his voice stronger now. "But Gerald wanted me to have this.
For some reason, he trusted me.
And I'm not going to let him down." Derek's eyes turned to ice. "Then you're a fool. And you're going to regret this." He turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Victoria lingered for a moment, studying Pedro's face. "You know, Gerald always said the measure of a person is what they do when there's nothing to gain. But let me ask you something, Mr. Carlson. What happens when there's everything to lose?" She turned and followed Derek out the door. Pedro stood in the massive entrance hall, his heart pounding. Daniel put a hand on his shoulder. You just made yourself some very powerful enemies, Mr. Carlson. I know, Pedro said.
Good.
Because now the real fight begins. But Pedro didn't know just how right Daniel was. Because at that very moment, 3 blocks away, Derek Eubanks was making a phone call. He refused the offer, Derek said into his phone. Which means we proceed to phase 2. A voice on the other end said something. Derek's face hardened. I don't care what it takes. Gerald should have died 3 months ago. We've come too far to let some homeless nobody ruin everything now. Do whatever is necessary. Just make sure there's no connection back to us. Derek hung up and looked at Victoria, who was sitting in the car beside him. It's done, he said.
Victoria nodded slowly.
And the dog. If necessary, the dog too. Pedro Carlson had just become a billionaire. He had also just become a dead man walking. By noon that same day, the story had exploded. Pedro's face was on every channel. The worst photos too. Pictures from his time on the streets.
Dirty. Defeated.
Broken. News reporters were questioning whether a disgraced military veteran with a dishonorable discharge should inherit billions. Derek Eubanks was on television, smooth and practiced, explaining that his uncle was not of sound mind in his final months. Pedro sat in Gerald's study watching the coverage with growing horror. They're destroying me, he said quietly. And I haven't even done anything. Daniel, who was sitting nearby, nodded grimly. This is their strategy. Discredit you publicly so that when they challenge the will, the court of public opinion is already on their side. Pedro stood and walked to the window. Outside, news vans were parked along the street. Reporters with cameras. Crowds of curious onlookers. Why did he do this? Pedro whispered. Why did Gerald choose me?
I'm nobody.
I can't fight these people. Blaze walked up beside Pedro and sat down, pressing his weight against Pedro's leg. The dog looked up at him with those intelligent, loyal eyes. And suddenly Pedro understood. He didn't choose me because I could fight. He chose me because I showed compassion when I had nothing to gain. That was the test. Exactly, Daniel said. Gerald spent 40 years in the business world surrounded by people who only cared about money.
But you?
You gave your last meal to a dying dog. That's who Gerald wanted to inherit his legacy. Daniel was interrupted by his phone ringing. He glanced at the screen and his face went pale. What? Pedro asked. What is it? Daniel answered the call, listened for a moment, then hung up. We have a problem. A big one. Daniel pulled out a tablet and showed Pedro's security footage from that morning, the alley where Pedro had been sleeping. This was taken 2 hours after we picked you up. The footage showed 2 men in dark clothing entering the alley. They searched Pedro's cardboard shelter, looked around, then got back in an unmarked van and drove away. Daniel fast-forwarded the footage. The same van appeared again that afternoon. This time, the men planted something. A tracking device. You think they're going to try to kill me? Pedro asked. I think that $4.7 billion is a very strong motive for murder. And Derek's already made it clear he won't let you walk away with his uncle's fortune. A new voice spoke from the doorway. No, you should have taken the $50 million. A woman walked into the study. She was in her early 40s, Asian American, wearing jeans and a leather jacket. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she had the confident stance of someone who'd spent years in law enforcement. Who are you? Pedro asked. The woman extended her hand.
Sara Kimo.
Private investigator. Former FBI. Mr. Wright hired me this morning to look into Derek and Victoria. And what I found, it's worse than we thought. Sarah pulled out her tablet and set it on the desk. Derek Eubanks and Victoria Chin aren't just challenging the will. They've been embezzling from Eubanks Technologies for the past 2 years. $800 million in illegal transactions. They've been selling Gerald's proprietary AI technology to foreign governments. nations that the US has sanctions against. It's not just corporate fraud, it's potentially treason. But here's where it gets interesting, Sarah continued. 3 months ago, Gerald discovered what they were doing. He compiled evidence. He was scheduled to testify before a congressional committee about the illegal sales. And then he disappeared, Pedro said, realization dawning.
Exactly.
The night before his scheduled testimony, Gerald Eubanks vanished from his penthouse. No forced entry.
No witnesses.
Just gone. Sarah leaned forward. I don't think Gerald is dead, Mr. Carlson. I think he's being held somewhere. And I think Derek and Victoria are keeping him alive just long enough to fully transfer the stolen assets. You think they kidnapped him? Pedro asked. I think they poisoned him and left him somewhere to die slowly. But Gerald is smarter than they realize. That holographic will? That was his insurance policy. If he didn't check in every 72 hours, the will would activate and everything would go to whoever saved Blaze. But why Blaze? Pedro asked. Sarah smiled. Because Blaze was with Gerald the night he disappeared. The dog is a witness. And more importantly, Blaze is a trained military canine. He knows how to track. He knows how to search and rescue. Blaze is the only one who knows where Gerald is. And that's why Derek and Victoria want him dead too. The pieces were falling into place now. Gerald hadn't just been looking for someone with compassion. He'd been looking for someone who would protect his dog. Because Blaze was the key to everything. Pedro stood up, his military training kicking back in. Then we need to find Gerald. Before it's too late. There's one more thing you need to know, Sarah said, her voice heavy. She pulled up a photo on her tablet. A family photo from decades ago. Victoria Chin isn't just Gerald's business partner. She's your aunt. Pedro stared at the photo. His father's face stared back at him. And beside his father stood a younger Victoria.
No, Pedro whispered.
That's impossible. Your father was David Carlson. Victoria was born Victoria Carlson before she married and changed her name to Chin. She's your father's older sister. Pedro felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. She disowned us. When my dad married my mom, Victoria said he was marrying beneath him. She cut him off completely. Sarah nodded. And when your parents died in that car accident 12 years ago, you tried to reach out to her. She refused to help, Pedro said bitterly. She said I wasn't her responsibility. I was 17. I had to drop out of college to support myself. That's why I joined the military. She knows who you are, Pedro, Sarah said quietly. She's known since the moment Daniel picked you up. And now you're not just threatening her billion-dollar theft. Your family that she abandoned. You're a living reminder of her betrayal. Pedro sank back into the chair, his mind reeling. His own aunt. The woman who'd let him fall into homelessness. And now she wanted him dead. Daniel's phone lit up with an alert. He looked at it and his face went white. Pedro, we need to leave.
Now. What?
Why? The tracking device they planted. It's active. And according to our security team, there's a vehicle approaching the mansion.
Fast.
Before anyone could react, the study window exploded inward. Bullets tore through the room, shattering priceless paintings, destroying furniture. Sarah returned fire through the broken window. Go. Get him out of here, she yelled to Daniel. Daniel grabbed Pedro's arm and pulled him toward a hidden door in the wall, a panic room entrance. But Pedro resisted. Blaze. I'm not leaving without Blaze. The dog was already beside him, pressed against his leg, barking furiously at the window. They ran through the hidden door, just as another spray of bullets ripped through the study. The panic room was small, concrete, lined with monitors showing security feeds. Who are they? Pedro gasped, his heart pounding. Professional killers, Daniel said, his hands shaking as he locked the reinforced door. Derek didn't waste any time. On the monitors, they could see Sarah engaging the attackers. 3 men in black tactical gear. She took down one, but the other two were advancing. We have to help her, Pedro said. We will, but not by getting killed. Daniel was already on his phone, calling the police. Pedro watched the monitors. Watched Sarah fighting for her life. Fighting for his life. And he realized something. He'd spent 3 years feeling worthless. Feeling like he didn't matter. Like the world would be better off without him.
But now?
People were putting their lives on the line for him. Because Gerald had seen something in him. Something worth protecting. Pedro wasn't going to let that be for nothing. Daniel, Pedro said, his voice steady now. I want to fight back. I want to find Gerald. And I want to bring Derek and Victoria down. Daniel looked at him with new respect. Then let's start by surviving tonight. Police sirens wailed in the distance. The gunfire stopped. Sarah Kim survived the attack.
Barely.
One bullet grazed her shoulder. Another hit her vest. But she'd held them off long enough for the police to arrive. The 3 attackers were killed in the firefight. Professional mercenaries with no identification. Untraceable. But everyone knew who'd sent them. The next morning, the police wanted to talk to Pedro. They were treating this as an assassination attempt. Derek and Victoria were being brought in for questioning. Will anything stick? Pedro asked Daniel. Probably not. The attackers are dead. No evidence linking them to Derek or Victoria. They'll claim they're victims too. We need another approach, Pedro said quietly. We're playing defense. We need to go on offense. I want to talk to Victoria. Alone. Victoria Chin agreed to meet. That itself was suspicious. But Pedro had something she wanted to know, whether he was going to back down. They met in a private room at one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. Victoria was already seated when he arrived, sipping champagne like she didn't have a care in the world. Pedro, she said, not standing. You look terrible. The stress of wealth not agreeing with you. Pedro sat across from her. Blaze lay down at his feet, never taking his eyes off Victoria. You tried to have me killed last night. Victoria's face didn't change. That's a serious accusation. One you can't prove. I'm not here to prove anything. I'm here to understand why. Victoria set down her glass and studied him. You really don't know, do you? Know what? Why I left your family. Why I refused to help when your parents died. Pedro's jaw clenched. You said my mother was a gold digger. You said she was beneath our family.
Elite.
Pedro froze. Victoria's mask slipped for the first time. Real emotion, pain, regret flickered across her face. Your mother was wonderful.
Kind.
Generous. Everything I wasn't. When your father chose her, chose love over ambition, I was jealous. Because I'd spent my entire life chasing money and power, and your father had found something I never could. She looked back at Pedro. So I cut him off. I told myself he'd made a mistake. That he'd come crawling back when the money ran out. But he never did. Because he was happy. Truly happy. And I was miserable in my mansion with my money and my empty life. When they died, Victoria continued, her voice breaking, I wanted to help you.
God, I wanted to.
But I couldn't face you. Couldn't face the reminder of what I'd thrown away. So I told myself you'd be fine. That you didn't need me. Tears were running down her face now. But you did need me. And I abandoned you. Just like I abandoned your father. Pedro sat in stunned silence. Then why, he finally asked. Why are you doing this now? Why try to kill me? Victoria wiped her eyes, and when she looked at him again, the vulnerability was gone, replaced by cold calculation. Because it's too late for redemption, Pedro. I've made my choices. I've stolen hundreds of millions. I've helped kidnap Gerald. I've crossed lines that can't be uncrossed. And I will not go to prison for it. Not for Gerald, not for Derek, and not for you. She leaned forward. Where is he? Pedro demanded. Where's Gerald?
Victoria smiled coldly.
That's the question, isn't it? Even Derek doesn't know. Gerald was smarter than we realized. He escaped from where we were holding him, but he was already poisoned. The toxin we gave him, it's slow acting. Organ failure, memory loss, disorientation. Pedro's blood ran cold. You're letting him die somewhere alone? We're waiting for him to die, Victoria corrected. And once he does, the will becomes null. If we find his body within the probate period and can prove he died before the will was fully executed, Derek gets the company. I get my freedom, and you get to go back to the streets where you belong. Pedro stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. Gerald is still alive, and I'm going to find him.
How? Victoria laughed.
You don't even know where to start looking. Yes, I do. Pedro looked down at Blaze. I have the only witness. The only one Gerald trusted. That dog was with Gerald the night he escaped. Blaze knows exactly where he is. I just need to let him show me. Victoria's smile faltered. Then I'm sorry, Pedro, because you've just told me what I need to do. Victoria stood up and pulled out her phone. If you leave this restaurant with that dog, you won't make it 3 blocks. Derek has people positioned all over this area. They have orders to kill both of you on sight. Pedro's heart raced. It was a trap. This whole meeting was a trap. But I'm going to give you one last chance, Victoria said. Leave the dog here. Walk away. Take the 50 million we offered. Disappear. And I promise you'll live. And if I refuse? Victoria's face was emotionless. Then you'll die. Tonight. Along with anyone who tries to help you. Pedro looked at Blaze. The dog was staring up at him, trusting, loyal, waiting for his command. Gerald had trusted this dog with everything. His fortune,
his life,
his legacy. And Blaze had led him to Pedro. Now it was Pedro's turn to prove he was worthy of that trust. No, Pedro said firmly. I'm not leaving him, and I'm going to find Gerald.
Victoria Said.
Then you're a fool, just like your father. She pressed something on her phone. Immediately, Pedro heard footsteps. Multiple people moving toward the private dining room. Run, Victoria said simply. It's your only chance. Pedro didn't hesitate. He grabbed Blaze and ran for the emergency exit. Behind them, gunfire erupted. People screamed. Chaos exploded through the restaurant. Pedro burst through the exit door into an alley and found himself face to face with 3 armed men. This was it. He was trapped. But then Blaze launched himself at the nearest gunman, 60 pounds of pure military training. He hit the man's arm just as he fired, sending the bullet wild. Blaze, run. Pedro screamed. But the dog wouldn't leave him. Pedro grabbed a metal trash can lid and swung it at the second gunman. His military hand-to-hand combat training came flooding back. Strike.
Deflect.
Move. He took down one man. Then another. But the third gunman aimed and fired. Pedro felt a burning pain in his shoulder. He'd been hit. He stumbled, falling to his knees. The gunman stepped forward, aiming for Pedro's head. NYPD, drop your weapon. The gunman hesitated for just a second, and Blaze lunged, knocking him down. Within seconds, police officers swarmed the alley. Pedro collapsed against the wall, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Blaze was beside him immediately, whimpering, licking his face. I'm okay, boy, Pedro gasped.
I'm okay.
As the paramedics loaded him into an ambulance, Pedro saw Victoria being led away in handcuffs. She'd been caught in the restaurant after the shooting started. Their eyes met for one last moment, and Victoria mouthed 2 words, I'm sorry. The bullet had gone clean through Pedro's shoulder. Painful, but not life-threatening. He'd been lucky. But Victoria and Derek? Their luck had run out. The restaurant shooting had been captured on multiple cameras. The gunman had been traced back to a shell company owned by Derek. Victoria, caught at the scene, had been arrested. And under interrogation, Facing decades in prison, she'd made a choice. She'd decided to talk. Victoria confessed everything. Gerald Eubanks discovered that Derek and she were embezzling funds 18 months ago. They'd been selling his AI technology to foreign governments, China, North Korea, Iran. $800 million. Maybe more. Gerald compiled evidence. He was going to testify before Congress. They couldn't let that happen. So Derek and Victoria poisoned him with a slow-acting neurotoxin. It causes gradual organ failure, disorientation, memory loss. They needed him to die slowly so they could set up the cover story. But Gerald was stronger than they expected. He realized what they'd done. The night before his scheduled testimony, he escaped from his penthouse with Blaze. They'd been searching for 3 months, waiting for him to die. Victoria's confession was enough. Derek was arrested within hours. Both faced charges of attempted murder, kidnapping, corporate fraud, and conspiracy. But Gerald was still out there. Somewhere.
Dying.
Pedro sat up in his hospital bed, his shoulder bandaged, his mind racing. Daniel and Sarah were there, Sarah with her own bandaged shoulder, both of them looking exhausted. Victoria gave us everything, Daniel said. Dates, financial records, communication logs. Derek's done. They're both going to prison for the rest of their lives. But Gerald is still missing, Pedro said. Pedro looked at Blaze, who was lying on the floor beside the bed. The dog hadn't left his side since the shooting. Victoria said Gerald escaped 3 months ago. Where would he go? Where would someone go if they were poisoned, disoriented, running for their life? Sarah pulled out her tablet. I've been mapping Gerald's properties and known locations. He owns 17 properties in New York alone, plus storage units, office spaces, land holdings. He wouldn't go somewhere obvious, Pedro said. Derek would check all of those. Pedro closed his eyes, thinking. He'd been homeless for 3 years. He knew what it was like to need shelter, to need a place to hide where no one would look. Abandoned places, Pedro said suddenly. Places people forget about. Where would someone like Gerald, someone rich and powerful, even know about a place like that? Sarah's eyes widened. His father. Gerald's father was a construction worker before he started Eubanks Technologies. He built the company from nothing. She typed rapidly on her tablet. Gerald's father owned several properties in the Bronx back in the 1970s. Industrial warehouses. Most were sold, but one wasn't. An old textile factory. It's been condemned for 15 years. Pedro sat up straighter. That's it. That has to be it.
It's a long shot, Daniel said. No.
Pedro looked at Blaze. It's the right place. I can feel it. Blaze, do you know where Gerald is, boy? The dog's ears perked up. He stood immediately, his tail wagging. Blaze ran to the hospital room door and scratched at it, whimpering. He knew. Against medical advice, Pedro checked himself out of the hospital. They drove to the Bronx in Sarah's SUV. The abandoned textile factory was in a forgotten industrial area. Razor wire fences, broken windows, graffiti-covered walls. The moment they stopped, Blaze jumped out and took off running. Blaze. Wait. Pedro ran after him, his shoulder screaming in pain. The dog didn't stop. He ran straight toward the factory's main entrance, barking frantically. Pedro reached the entrance, a heavy metal door hanging off its hinges. Blaze was already inside, disappearing into the darkness. Pedro pulled out his phone's flashlight and followed. Inside, the factory was a maze. Rusted machinery, collapsed stairs,
Decades of decay.
but Blaze knew exactly where he was going. The dog led them deeper into the building, down a set of concrete stairs into what must have been the basement level. And then Blaze stopped, in front of a small door, almost invisible in the shadows. The dog scratched at it, whimpering desperately. Pedro's hands shook as he pushed the door open. Inside was a small room, emergency lighting flickering, and on a makeshift bed in the corner, Gerald Eubanks. He was barely recognizable. Gaunt, pale, his white hair matted.
But alive.
And 4 lines ran from his arm to a nearly empty bag hanging from a pipe. Medical supplies scattered around the room. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered behind Pedro. Pedro rushed forward and dropped to his knees beside Gerald. "Mr. Eubanks? Gerald? Can you hear me?" Gerald's eyes flickered open. Cloudy.
Confused.
"Who?" "My name is Pedro Carlson. I found your dog. I found Blaze." At the sound of the dog's name, Gerald's eyes focused slightly. Blaze. The dog jumped onto the bed, licking Gerald's face, whimpering with joy. Gerald's hand, shaking, weak, reached up to stroke Blaze's head. "Good boy," he whispered. "You found him. You found someone worthy." Tears streamed down Pedro's face. "I'm calling an ambulance," Daniel said, already on his phone. "Gerald," Pedro said, gripping the old man's hand. "Stay with me. You're going to be okay. Help is coming." Gerald's eyes met Pedro's. "You shared your bread with him." "Yes." "Even though you had nothing." "Yes." Gerald smiled weakly. "That's why I chose you. Character, not wealth. Compassion, not greed." "Save your strength," Pedro said. But Gerald shook his head slightly. "The company, the fortune, all yours now.
Use it to help people.
Like you helped my boy." "I will. I promise." Gerald's grip tightened on Pedro's hand. "Thank you for saving him. For being the man I hoped existed." "You saved me, Gerald," Pedro said, his voice breaking. "You gave me my life back." The paramedics swarmed the room, immediately working on Gerald. For fluids, oxygen, emergency medication to counteract the poison. As they loaded him onto a stretcher, Blaze refused to leave his side. "The dog comes with us," one paramedic said. "He's keeping the patient's vitals stable." Pedro, Sarah, and Daniel followed the ambulance to the hospital. And for the first time in 3 months, there was hope. Gerald Eubanks survived. The doctors said it was a miracle. The neurotoxin should have killed him weeks ago. But somehow, through sheer will and careful self-administered treatment, Gerald had kept himself alive. He'd been waiting for Blaze to lead the right person to him. And Blaze had. 1 week later, Gerald sat propped up in his hospital bed, looking thin but alert. Color had returned to his face. The confusion in his eyes was gone. Pedro sat in the chair beside him. Blaze lay on the floor between them, finally at peace. "I need to know," Pedro said quietly. "Why did you do it? Why leave everything to a stranger?" Gerald smiled. "Because I spent 40 years learning what money can't buy. I built an empire, made billions. But every relationship I had was poisoned by greed. My nephew saw me as a wallet. My business partner saw me as a means to steal. Every woman who showed interest was after my money." He looked at Blaze. "The only one who loved me for me was this dog.
So I made him my test."
Whoever showed genuine compassion to Blaze, that person would be someone I could trust with everything I'd built. "But you could have given it to charity," Pedro said. "Foundations are run by people. People who can be corrupted." Gerald shook his head. "I wanted to find one person with real character. Someone who would sacrifice for a creature they'd never met, with nothing to gain." He looked directly at Pedro. "You were starving. You gave your last meal to a dying dog. That's not just kindness, Pedro. That's character. That's who I want running my company." Gerald reached for a folder on his bedside table and handed it to Pedro. "The board voted 3 days ago. You're the new CEO. I'm staying on as chairman until you're ready to take full control. But Pedro, this is yours now. All of it." Pedro opened the folder. Official documents. Board resolutions. His name on company letterhead. "I don't deserve this," Pedro whispered. "Yes, you do. That's the point." Gerald's voice softened. And Pedro, about your discharge. I made some calls. I have friends in the Pentagon. The investigation into your court-martial has been reopened. The officers who gave those illegal orders are being charged. Your discharge is being reviewed. Pedro's hands started shaking. You did that. You lost everything for doing the right thing. It's time the world acknowledged that. For 3 years, Pedro had carried the shame of that discharge, had believed he was worthless, a failure, and now vindication. Finally, thank you, was all he could say. Daniel entered with news. Victoria and Derek's trial date has been set. With Victoria's testimony, the prosecution is confident of conviction. We're looking at 25 to 30 years for Derek, 20 to 25 for Victoria. And the stolen money? Gerald asked. Being recovered. About $600 million has been traced so far. It'll be returned to Eubanks Technologies. Gerald nodded slowly. Good. Pedro, I want you to use some of that money, $50 million, to start a foundation. The Carlson Foundation for Homeless Veterans. Pedro's eyes widened. Gerald, that's what you would have done anyway, Gerald interrupted. You've been homeless. You know what they need. Housing, job training, mental health support,
Dignity.
Build something that would have helped you 3 years ago. Pedro looked down at Blaze, who was looking up at him with those loyal, trusting eyes. I won't let you down, Pedro said. I know you won't, Gerald replied. That's why I chose you. 2 months later, the transformation was complete. Pedro Carlson, former homeless veteran, stood in a designer suit at the opening of the Carlson Foundation's first veteran housing facility. 500 units. Free for 2 years. Job training programs. Counseling services. Medical care. Everything Pedro had needed 3 years ago and couldn't find. Gerald stood beside him, recovered now, using only a cane for support. News cameras captured everything. But Pedro's eyes were on the crowd, on the faces of the veterans moving into their new apartments. Some crying, some in disbelief. All of them getting a second chance, just like he had. Pedro stepped up to the microphone. 3 months ago, I was sleeping in an alley behind a restaurant in Hell's Kitchen. I was hungry, hopeless. I thought I was worthless, that the world had no place for me. Pedro paused, his voice thick with emotion. Then I found a dog, a dying German shepherd, and I made a choice. I shared my last piece of bread with him, not because I expected anything in return, but because it was the right thing to do. He looked at Blaze, who sat proudly at his feet. That one act of compassion changed everything. It brought me here. It gave me back my life. It showed me that even when you have nothing, you still have the power to help someone else. So to every veteran here today, to everyone who's struggled, who's been told they're worthless, who's been invisible to the world, I want you to know you matter. Your service matters. Your life matters. And this foundation, this is just the beginning. We're going to help 10,000 veterans in the next 5 years, because everyone deserves a second chance. The crowd erupted in applause. After the speech, Pedro noticed a young man standing alone near the edge of the crowd. He was maybe 23, wearing a torn military jacket, his eyes hollow with pain that Pedro recognized immediately. Pedro walked over and extended his hand. Impel. The young man looked surprised that anyone was talking to him. I, Marcus. Were you in the service, Marcus? Marines. 2 tours in Afghanistan. I came back with nothing. No family. No home. I've been on the streets for 8 months. Pedro nodded slowly. I know what that's like. I was there too. For 3 years. Marcus looked up surprised. You? But you're... I'm someone who got a second chance. And now I want to give you one too. Pedro pulled out a business card. This is my direct number. I want you to call me tomorrow. We're going to get you an apartment here, get you into our job training program, and we're going to help you rebuild your life." Tears streamed down Marcus's face.
Why?
"You don't even know me." Pedro smiled. "Someone once told me that the measure of a person is what they do when they have nothing to gain. 3 months ago, someone gave me everything because I showed compassion to a dog. Now it's my turn to pass that forward." Pedro Carlson's life had been transformed by a single act of kindness. But the transformation didn't stop with him. Over the next year, the Carlson Foundation helped 3,000 homeless veterans find housing, employment, and hope. Gerald Eubanks fully recovered and continued as chairman of Eubanks Technologies, while Pedro learned to run the company. Together, they transformed the company's culture, prioritizing ethics and social responsibility. Derek Eubanks was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. Victoria Chun received 25 years. But before she was sent to prison, she requested one final meeting. Pedro sat across from Victoria in the prison visiting room, a glass partition between them. She looked older now.
Smaller.
The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by an orange jumpsuit. "Thank you for coming," Victoria said quietly. Pedro said nothing. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I abandoned you when you needed family. I tried to have you killed."
There's no coming back from that.
She wiped tears from her eyes. "But I want you to know, your father would be proud of you, of the man you've become. Despite everything life threw at you, despite what I did to you, you became someone who helps others. Someone with real character." "I wish I could go back," Victoria whispered. "Change my choices. Be the aunt you deserved. But I can't. All I can do is tell you that seeing what you've become, it's the first time I've felt hope in decades." Pedro stood to leave. "Victoria," he said quietly. She looked up. "When you get out, and you will eventually call me, the foundation will have a place for you. Because everyone deserves a second chance. Even people who don't think they deserve it." Victoria broke down completely, sobbing into her hands. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, but it does mean refusing to let bitterness poison your future. Pedro had learned that lesson the hard way. And Blaze? Blaze never left Pedro's side. The dog became the unofficial mascot of the Carlson Foundation, visiting veterans, offering comfort, reminding everyone of the power of compassion. Because in the end, that's what it all came down to. One homeless veteran, one dying dog, one piece of bread shared in a dark alley. And the world was never the same. Pedro Carlson had been invisible, forgotten, worthless in the eyes of society. But Gerald Eubanks saw what others couldn't, that true wealth isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in character, in compassion, in the willingness to give when you have nothing left to give. 3 years of homelessness, 3 months of danger, 3 seconds of decision in a dark alley. That's all it took to change everything. Because sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest miracles. And sometimes sharing your last crust of bread with a stray dog makes you worthy of inheriting the world.